Thanks for joining me for another UK episode of Lights Out, your virtual campfire. I'm your hostess with the mostest ghosties, Sylvia Schultz. In this episode, we're going to visit wild, wonderful Scotland, home of tartans, Nessie, melt-in-your-mouth shortbread, and ghosts. Put on your kilts and join me as we go Lights Out. Edinburgh is a city rich in history and the paranormal. Let's jump right into the ghost stories. We went on an amazing ghost tour of the city. The tour began with a bloodthirsty tale at a tall monument in the middle of town called the Market Cross. This landmark has stood on Edinburgh's High Street since the Middle Ages. It was there that two men were tortured at the base of the monument in front of a shoving, jeering crowd for the crime of treason. This was back a couple of centuries ago, when public entertainment like that was more in vogue. The men were whipped until the blood ran in puddles at their feet, and they passed out. They were revived when someone got a bucket of salt and rubbed fistfuls of it into their wounds. Then one man had his ear nailed to the monument, and the other had his tongue cut out and the corners of his mouth slit so that his jaw unhinged. You see, one of them had said something treasonous. He'd toasted the English king, not something one usually did in Scotland, and the other had listened to that treason and said, "Hear, hear," in response to the toast. A grisly example of letting the punishment fit the crime. We walked down the Royal Mile and ducked into one of the little alleyways. These narrow, dark little streets are called closes, and they are rather grim to someone used to wide open spaces. The buildings on each side of the close loom 6, 7, or 8 stories tall. In the old days, everyone lived in the closes, rich and poor alike. All classes of people lived and worked here. The wealthy lived on the top floors of these buildings, above all the filth of the streets, while the poor lived at the bottom. In 1689, a judge named Sir George Lockhart lived in Old Bank Close. He heard a case against John Chiesley. He and his wife had several children, but Chiesley wasn't fit to be either a father or a husband. He drank his paycheck, chased other women, all sorts of bad behavior. Lockhart heard the divorce case and granted a divorce, ruling that Chiesley had to pay upkeep of £93 per year for his wife and children. £93 in 1689 was a lot of money, and Chiesley was not happy about this ruling at all. He stalked Judge Lockhart for days, brooding. After the service on Easter Sunday, 1689, he followed the judge home and murdered him on his own doorstep. He was caught and tortured. His feet were crammed into a device called booties, which were splintery pieces of wood that were tightened over his feet. Then his right arm was cut off and propped up in front of him, so that the last thing he saw was his own hand waving goodbye as he faded into death. Gruesome stuff. Chiesley's ghost began to haunt the close. The entity became known as Johnny One-Arm for obvious reasons. Much later, a house in Dalry was being remodeled. The hearthstone was dug up, and underneath were the skeletal remains of a man who was missing his right arm. The tour of the Blair Street vaults was cool, too. We went down stone steps into the vaults below the streets of Edinburgh. These were used as workplaces for a while for various trades, then later as shelter for the poorest of the poor who had no other place to live. It was pretty grim, and there's no wonder there are ghosts down there. While we were in the vaults, standing around in the dimly lit gloom, our guide told us another story, which gave even me the shivers. Centuries ago there was supposedly a tunnel that ran under the Royal Mile from Edinburgh Castle at the top of the road to Holyrood House at the bottom. The tunnel was eventually bricked up, and only rumors of it remained. That changed one dark night in the 19th century. It was the custom to fire a cannon every day at 1 p.m. as sort of a timekeeper for the city. One night, a pair of city guards were on duty, and they'd been drinking. They thought it would be a hilarious prank to fire the cannon at 1 in the morning. They loaded up the cannon and fired it, but in their drunken state they didn't make sure of where the back of the cannon was. The recoil smacked the end of the gun into a wall, and it crumbled to reveal a passageway. The two soldiers were too chicken to explore the dark tunnel, so they got the regiment's piper boy out of bed. It took some talking and some bribery, but they finally convinced the kid to go down into the dark, creepy tunnel and play his pipes, walking as far as he could. The idea was that while he played, the two men up top would follow the sound, and together they would discover where the tunnel led. The boy went down into the darkness and began to play. The men followed the sound of the pipes nearly all the way down the Royal Mile, getting more and more excited as they went. They'd finally discovered the secret tunnel after all this time. But before they got all the way to Holyrood, the sound of the pipes stopped. The men listened intently. Maybe the boy had stopped to rest. 10 minutes turned to 20. After half an hour had gone by, the soldiers started getting concerned. Maybe the boy had gone back to the entrance? They went back up to the street to Edinburgh Castle, but the piper boy wasn't at the tunnel entrance either. Now the men, sobering up, were even more concerned. It seemed unlikely that the boy could have fallen asleep in the tunnel, but it was possible. The men lit a torch and went down into the tunnel to look for the boy. They found nothing. The tunnel had been bricked up below as well. After only a few yards, it ended in a dead end. The young piper boy was never found and never seen again. Edinburgh also has a white lady who haunts Corstorphine, a suburb on the west side. This was once the site of Corstorphine Castle, home of Laird James Forrester. Laird James was a very charming fellow who loved his whiskey and loved his women. The combination got him into trouble in 1679. The road to Corstorphine Castle was once lined with sycamore trees, which had been planted in the mid-1400s. The laird was in the habit of meeting his lovers on this lane, near the old Dovecote. One of these women was Lady Christian Hamilton Nimmo. She was the wife of a rich Edinburgh merchant, and the niece of the laird's first wife. Lady Nimmo was renowned for her exquisite beauty and for her fiery temper. One night Forrester arranged to meet Lady Nimmo at their regular place near the Dovecote. When she arrived, accompanied by her servant, Forrester wasn't there. Lady Nimmo waited for quite some time, getting more and more irritated by Forrester's failure to show. Finally, she sent her servant to look for him at one of the local pubs. Forrester did eventually turn up, drunk, foul-mouthed, and in an irritable mood at having been summoned from his carousing. He picked a fight with Lady Nimmo, shouting at her and insulting her, calling her a whore. Lady Nimmo was not about to be treated this way, especially after she had waited around for Forrester. She threw a couple of nasty insults right back at him. Then her temper got the better of her. She grabbed Forrester's sword and yanked it from the scabbard. Then she ran him through with his own blade, stabbing him through the heart. Lady Nimmo was soon captured by the laird's sons, and immediately confessed to her crime. She was brought to the Market Cross for execution, and was beheaded. She dressed all in white to meet her death, and after death she still wears her pure white gown. She haunts the dovecote where her heart was broken by the drunken Laird Forrester. In her hand she grasps the laird's sword, which still drips with his heart's blood. Of course, if you're interested in both history and the paranormal, one of the most famous parts of Edinburgh is Mary King's Close. I mentioned the closes earlier. While it's true that well-to-do people like Sir George Lockhart lived in the closes, the narrow alleys were not very pleasant places, but many people made their homes here. One of these people was a young woman named Mary King. We don't know much about Mary, but what we do know gives us a new respect for her. She was born in the late 1500s. She married a merchant named Thomas Nimmo in 1616, and they had 4 children: Alexander, Euphemie, Janet, and William. Sadly, Thomas died in 1629, leaving Mary alone with 4 young children ranging in age from 5 to 12 years old. Soon after Thomas's death, Mary moved her family to Alexander King's Close. Alexander King was a prominent lawyer in Edinburgh who died in 1619. Mary was no relation to Alexander, but with the similarities in their names and Mary's success as a merchant in her own right, the name of the street eventually morphed into Mary King's Close. Mary traded fabrics and sewed and embroidered clothes for a living. She did well enough to rent a shop on the high street for her business. She and her children worked hard, but her little shop was a success. When she died in September 1644, her will mentions things like 2 gold rings, 6 silver spoons, 9 dozen table napkins, 14 pairs of sheets, 4 plaids or kilts, the long pieces of tartan worn by Scots men, doublets or trousers of velvet, 10 spools of silk sewing thread, more than 60 pillows and cushions, and lots of wine and beer. So we've met the historical Mary King. Why is Mary King's Close so beloved by paranormal investigators as well as historians? Well, in December 1644, about 3 months after Mary's death, Edinburgh was visited by the plague. Scotland was no stranger to outbreaks of the plague, and the authorities tried to contain the disease. The wealthy got out of town as soon as they could, but many people didn't have the luxury of that option. There is an enduring myth, as if history needs any help to make it spookier, that people, sick and well alike, were walled up in the close and left to starve. Happily, this isn't true. In fact, plague doctors were well prepared to care for the ill. People infected with the plague were quarantined in their homes, but they had bread, ale, coal, and even wine delivered to them daily. But even with this care, people died of the plague in Edinburgh, just as they did all over Europe. At least 1 out of every 5 residents died, and the death toll may have been as high as 50%. In the nearby port town of Leith, Scotland, it's estimated that as many as 2/3 of the population were killed by the disease. With all of the history that Mary King's Close has seen, it's no wonder that the narrow street is one of the most haunted places in Edinburgh. People started seeing spectres and nameless terrors less than 40 years after the plague outbreak took so many lives. Thomas Colthart and his wife moved into a house in Mary King's Close in 1685. Almost immediately their maid quit and fled the house, insisting the place was haunted. One Sunday soon after, Thomas and his wife were startled by the apparition of a man's disembodied head floating in the air. Mrs. Colthart fainted, and the phantom vanished. It came back after supper, though, and this time the floating head had a companion, a young child wearing a coat. Thomas and his wife prayed aloud, hoping to banish the spooks, but it didn't work. A severed arm appeared and waved to them. Now, if you're thinking of John Chiesley, One-Armed Johnny, remember that he hadn't yet committed the crime that resulted in his having his arm chopped off. That was in 1689, 4 years after this particular ghost story. After the spooky floating arm, a ghost dog ran into the room, followed by a ghost cat, and a whole troop of weird little creatures. Then the couple heard an almighty groan, and all of the spirits disappeared. That was just the beginning of the ghost stories. People reported hearing scratching noises coming from inside a chimney where a child chimney sweep was said to have died. Other witnesses have seen ghosts pacing the street, a worried-looking man and a woman in black. And of course One-Armed Johnny put in a regular appearance for centuries. Perhaps strangest of all is the story of a little girl who has come to be known as Annie. Some years ago, a Japanese psychic, Aiko Gibo, came to visit while making a film about the haunted places of Britain, and could barely step inside a room off Allen's Close for the pain and unhappiness she could feel there. "I cannot enter this room. It is too strong. There is a child beside me. Her little hand is clutching my trouser leg. I just cannot go into this room. She was separated from her parents. She wants to go home and see her family. Her desire haunts this place very strongly." Eventually, Gibo was able to cross the threshold. Inside the room, she communicated with the young girl's spirit near the recess cut into the wall to the right of the fireplace. "She wants me to ask her mummy why she left her. She didn't know that she had the plague. Her mum lied to her to take her here and then abandon her, probably to protect her siblings. Can you get a small doll for the little girl? She has lost her favorite doll and is heartbroken." Gibo had a doll brought to comfort the child, who was absolutely delighted. And so long as the doll remains there, it is said that the room will never again be disturbed by her spirit. Ever since, growing numbers of people from all over the world have been bringing Annie dolls, toys, and jewelry. It's a phenomenon quite as extraordinary as the ghosts people see in the closes. I hope you've enjoyed this stroll through the splendidly haunted town of Edinburgh, Scotland. In the next episode, we're going to meet a killer who discovered that the grass wasn't greener, and a fellow who tried to cheat an imagined fate and lost. Join me next time as we go lights out.